The best place to start when you're taking a look at SQL Server security is to begin at the server level. Now, the reason I say server level is because there's actually multiple levels that we have to deal with security, and here's why. A single SQL Server can host multiple databases. Now, this is not a big shock. We've seen multiple databases out there in the Object Explorer and SQL Server Management Studio, but you have to think about the security implications of this. And so what's going to happen here is that SQL Server security is always implemented at two distinct separate levels. First of all, there's the server level, and this has to do with people being able to connect to the SQL Server. We want to authenticate anybody who logs on to the SQL Server. Then we have the database level, and notice these are two separate securable levels. Although you generally have to go through the SQL Server logon to get to one of the databases. So in this video, we're going to focus on the server level security, and a little later on in the course, we'll focus on security out there at the individual database level. The first thing that needs to happen is the user has to be authenticated to the SQL Server. And so this is where the user attempts to connect to the SQL Server. In our instance, we open up the SQL Server Management Studio and the little window pops up and it wants us to authenticate to the SQL Server. Then the second step is this user also has to be authenticated into the individual specific databases that they have been granted access to. The user has first connected to the SQL Server, and then they have to be authenticated into as many databases that they should be allowed to access. So understand, that's the two levels we're working at. Now let's back up to the server level again just for a moment. SQL Server provides two different methods for authenticating users at that server level. And here they are. There's Windows Authentication Mode, and there's SQL Server and Windows Authentication Mode. Now, these little names have changed over the various versions of SQL Server down through the years, and it can be just a little bit confusing. But let's talk about what each one of these are. Now, keep in mind, your SQL Server is always going to accept Windows Authentication. Notice Windows Authentication Mode is in both of these options, but that second option involves just SQL Server. So let's take a look at this. Also, before I jump over there, the SQL Server and Windows Authentication Mode is also referred to as mixed mode. So you'll always hear out there in the real world, you'll seldom hear the term SQL Server and Windows Authentication Mode. DBAs and others who are knowledgeable will say we're using mixed mode authentication on this server. So what is Windows Authentication Mode? It's actually also referred to as what's called a trusted connection, and that is exactly what's happening. The SQL Server simply utilizes the same username to authenticate the user on the SQL Server that was used to authenticate onto the operating system. And so what SQL Server is saying, well, wait a minute, this particular login has already been authenticated at the operating system level, be it the local security system or an Active Directory domain network security system. But either way, this particular user account has already been authenticated or it wouldn't be on the network. And so we're just going to use the Windows user account that the user logged on. And SQL Server says, well, if they were authenticated with this Windows user account at the operating system level, then they can come on in here. Now, we still have to kind of set that up. We have to map it to tell SQL Server, hey, you can trust this particular Windows user account. Now, this, by the way, is what Microsoft considers to be the most secure method. You're taking advantage of all the technology and functionalities that's built into protecting the authentication process at the Windows level. And so, as a result, this is the most secure method. However, understand this is not a method you can use in a number of situations. For example, if a user doesn't have a Windows user account within your system or within your Active Directory domain, they're not going to be able to use Windows Authentication Mode to log into SQL Server because SQL Server has no operating system login to trust. This is also in web environments. If people are connecting to the database via some sort of web environment or application, then once again, they don't have that Windows user account. Usually we handle that with impersonation and some other things, but just make sure you get the concept here. If there is a Windows login, SQL Server can trust that to provide authentication onto SQL Server at that server level. Now, the SQL Server and Windows Authentication mode, which is usually referred to as mixed mode, allows either or. It still allows that logins can come from Windows, but notice the difference here. Login accounts can also be created and maintained in the SQL Server security system. We can go out there and create a login account and a password. Both are stored in the SQL Server. So when we connect to the SQL Server, we don't even have to have a Windows authentication account. We can just simply put in the username and the password that are securely stored in the SQL Server database platform and log into SQL Server. And we can still trust the operating system login if we have one and if we've mapped that user in. And I'll show you how to do that later on in the course. This mode is always useful when access to SQL Server is needed by users who have accounts in the Windows domain, but especially if we're trying to allow access to the SQL Server by anybody who does not have a user account in the Windows domain. Now, when you set up SQL Server, you choose an authentication mode. We chose Windows Authentication. You can set it to either one of these during installation, but you can also go back and change this at any time. However, you just have to be aware of this, that if you go change the authentication mode for SQL Server, you're going to have to do a SQL Server restart before that new authentication mode becomes operational. And that can be the issue with changing authentication modes. You want to do it at a time when you don't have users connected and depending on the operations. Let's look out there in SQL Server Management Studio at how to manage the authentication mode. Also, rest assured, you will see some mention of the authentication mode on the exam. I'm in SQL Server Management Studio. I've already authenticated. And let me just back up here. I'm going to disconnect this connection and I'm going to connect again to the database engine. And notice right here, authentication, there's Windows authentication, and I can click the drop down and do SQL Server authentication. There's a couple of more here we won't get into right now. So if I'm a user who needs to connect using a user account that was been created in SQL Server, I would click this and notice I can now put in a username and a password. But for now, I'm going to click Windows Authentication. That's how we set it up, and that's how we're currently working in the environment. If I go up here and just right click on the server level, now I've got to be at the very top at the server level. All right, let me come off of here. Sometimes, let me show you a little quirk here in the interface. If I right click here, everything's the same. There are times when you need to click on it and select it and then right click. So just kind of keep an eye out for that. But we'll right click and we'll go down to properties. And when the server properties dialog box opens up, notice right here is the security section of this. And right here at the top, you see server authentication, Windows authentication mode, SQL Server, and Windows authentication mode. I can easily change this by clicking right here and choosing OK. And then notice it's going to tell me that some of my changes will not take effect until SQL Server is restarted. I will click OK here. And sometimes you can come out here and you can right click and you can restart, or the safest thing to do is go out into the services icon in the control panel and find the SQL Server service account and restart it out there. It's always more reliable out there. That is a quick look, and if I restart that SQL Server service, I will be in mixed mode. Go ahead and do that. I'm going to do it here, but you don't have to watch and wait. But we'll go ahead and do that, and we'll go into mixed mode, and we'll play with creating user accounts both ways a little bit later on in the course.